We're discussing the 2019 US Grand Prix in this episode of the PETRONAS Retro Race Review. Valtteri Bottas started on pole and Lewis was fifth on the grid, but managed to pass both Ferraris on the opening lap. Then came decisions about strategy, would it be a one or a two stop? Finally, the team decided to split the driver strategies. Valtteri took the win, Lewis made it a 1-2 and took his sixth driver title. Shov, when you look back on that race weekend, what comes to mind?
Well, I mean, always, the title is just such a massive thing. And you're in Austin. It's a great circuit, a great city. The crowd are brilliant there. So really, that's the memory that you'll always take away. And finishing that race with a 1-2 was just fantastic. So really good weekend for the team.
We've had lots of lovely questions in, so let's get straight into them. The first one coming from Ross H on Twitter. And he's asking how that fabulous section between 2 to 6 at COTA compares to Maggots and Beckett's at Silverstone or the S's at Suzuka. And how much does the track surface impact the way the car handles through these corners?
Yeah, so that's a really good sequence and the drivers love it. And you're right that in terms of its character, it is a bit like that Maggots and Beckett's complex because the corners are getting slower and slower and they're fiddly to balance because whatever balance you have going in, if you've got a car that's understeering, the problems normally get worse and worse as you go through that. So there are certainly some similarities. The tarmac, though, is quite different and that also affects the balance of the car and how hard it is on the rear axle. So it's a bit of both, really. They're not quite the same. You go to Austin with a very different setup to the one that you go to Silverstone with, but from the driver point, it's got that really rewarding and difficult complex that if you can get it right, it's very, very satisfying.
You mentioned car setup, and that takes me nicely on to Nick's question on Instagram, saying, to what extent did you adjust the setup of the car for the bumpy track? We know how bumpy it is at COTA.
It's very bumpy and it's got a very specific problem there. The circuit is shifting. It's a very sandy ground that they've built it on, and the circuit's sinking slightly. So most circuits, you know where the bumps are and they stay there year after year. But here, new bumps appear, and it's a very harsh winter, which doesn't help the problem. So often on a Friday, you're actually trying to figure out where they are, and then there's a question of can you drive around them, because some of them are so big you'd need to lift the car by 5-6 millimeters to avoid it. And at that point, you're probably better off seeing if the driver can find a line round it. In the extreme, though, ultimately, you often do need to pick the car up because if you keep it that low, you can actually end up breaking the bib. Some of the impacts are so hard.
Let's talk about qualifying. A great session for Valtteri, putting the car on pole position. Lewis finishing in fifth. Was there a problem? Did something happen to Lewis in qualifying?
Well, he definitely struggled a bit. Now, we were looking very good on Friday. I mean, Valtteri was having a solid weekend, but the wind changed from Friday to Saturday. And whereas we were breaking into turn 12, that big stop at the end of the back straight, on Friday it was a headwind, which helps the stability of the car, actually gives you more downforce because you've got that headwind adding to the car speed. The issue we had on Saturday was it swung round to a tailwind, and for whatever reason, we didn't seem as quick. So you say that Lewis was struggling, but also Valtteri looked like he was well ahead of the opposition. In effect, he was only just on pole. There was only about a tenth of a second separating the top four cars. So it was definitely a more difficult balance for us, and it was just instability on the brakes, and then the drivers couldn't really get the car to turn. It was understeering, and it just wasn't an easy one to work with.
We move now on to the race, and Lewis may have started in fifth, but he managed to clear both Ferraris on that opening lap. How important was that for you and your strategy?
Well, it's always really important to try and recover places early. If you can get through in the first few laps, you can have a race with the leaders. And obviously Lewis was ultra focused on making sure that the race win was always a possibility. So it was a big effect. And, if you're stuck there for 10, 15 laps, and there's a car that might be half a second or more slower, very quickly you get a loss of time that you can't really make back. So in those sorts of races where you're trying to recover places, it's that balance between taking risks, but making sure you don't hit someone, you don't damage your car, or you don't incur a penalty.
Sebastian Vettel damaged his car, breaking the rear suspension, which put him out of the race. And Aravinth has asked on Instagram, were you worried about your cars when you saw Seb's damage?
We were worried. It wasn't so much we were worried when we saw his damage, but we know that there's some really vicious curbs at Austin, some of those big bumps as well. And they can put loads through the suspension that are pretty close to what we call the proof limit, so the limit that it's designed for, that we know it's safe at. Now, we're monitoring those suspension loads. We also have people in the UK from the FEA department, so the finite element analysis, and they're the experts in understanding what the suspension can withstand in terms of the load cases. So there's this work going on in the UK. We're getting feedback onto the pit wall, and we can radio the drivers if we're concerned about loads that we're seeing. But really, it's just making sure that you stay within the limits that the car's actually designed for.
Going into the race, it looked like you were favouring a one-stop, and then you chose to go onto the two-stop with Valtteri. And Freya has asked, why did you have two different strategies for your drivers? Was it your plan from the beginning?
Well, we've always got options, and we know how we expect those strategies to perform. But in our pre-race plans, it looked like the one-stop was going to be the clear winner. That would give you the fastest overall race time. Now, as it happens on Sunday, it was a bit warmer, and this gave us a bit more rear degradation. It also shortened the tyre life. So when you're having to push them long for a one-stop, you get into the region where they're really starting to drop off and you lose lap time. So when we take the data that we collected on Sunday and we put it back into the simulation, you can now see that actually the two-stop looks like the better strategy. The one-stop becomes tricky. Now, that's the simulation side of it. But in reality, we're in the middle of a race here, and Verstappen pulled us onto a two-stop effectively by stopping quite early. Now, he had to stop because Lewis was right behind him. Lewis would have undercut him and taken that position if he didn't. So we would have expected them to do that. But when you're in that situation, often if you think you've got a slight car advantage, you're better off to do the strategy of your opponent rather than stick with your plans. So although we could already see that it was moving towards a two-stop, it made it even easier that Verstappen had done one for us to put Valtteri on it. Now, Lewis's situation was a bit different because by this stage, we could see that the Ferraris were not going to be a threat. Vettel out of the race. Leclerc was a long way back. So there was no risk from behind. And also, Lewis at this point was in P3. So the reason we kept him on a one-stop was actually we felt that would give him the best opportunity of getting back ahead of Verstappen. Often if you mirror another car's strategy, it's very, very difficult to overtake them. So we thought we'd take the risk. There wasn't really a lot to lose. He was never going to end up worse than P3, and it actually gave him a really good opportunity of getting further up.
Did you consider moving Lewis onto a two-stop at any point in the race?
We did. It sort of got to a stage, though, where you're quite committed to the one-stop. So we were thinking about the two, but the situation with the Ferraris being pretty much out of the picture meant that we could keep him on. There wasn't a risk from behind, and it actually gave him the best chance of attacking Verstappen, being on a different strategy.
We saw that wonderful battle between Valtteri and Lewis at the end. How good is it for you to see that on the pit wall, or is it just nerve-wracking?
It's a bit of both. I mean, it's certainly exciting. It's a little bit nerve-wracking, but they do respect each other. They understand what we expect in terms of the room that they give each other. And in this particular instance, Valtteri had much fresher tyres, so we were fairly confident he'd be able to find a way through without actually having to put his car at risk or Lewis's car at risk.
There were yellow flags at the end of the race. Did that help Lewis?
I think it did a bit. I mean, he was under a lot of pressure from Max. That's also one of the good opportunities to overtake. And as you know, the rules say that if there's a yellow flag within that region, you're not allowed to overtake another car. So it does provide a bit of protection. And if you know you're not going to be attacked there, it means you don't need to deploy all the energy that you might have otherwise done.
It was an amazing result for the team. A 1-2, Valtteri taking the win, Lewis taking his 6th driver title. What was it like being part of the team on that day?
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, we've been lucky to win quite a few championships recently. It's a very unique feeling, and it's something that everyone in Brackley and Brixworth are all working immensely hard to do this. So much effort goes into it over the course of the year. And when you get to the point where it's actually done, no one can take it off you. It's just immensely satisfying. And you've got to enjoy those moments because they don't come along very often in your life.
We really enjoyed that race back then, and I've really enjoyed reviewing it with you again today, Shov. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.